My name is Nick Espinoza, and I'm the head of special services at Authenticate. I'm joined today by Jake Williams, who is the head of Rendition Infosec and also a fantastic SANS instructor. So, Jake, thanks for hanging out with me today.
Oh, great hanging out with you. Good to see you again, Nick.
Yeah, likewise. So, our video series, we've kind of covered a couple topics. Obviously, the current landscape around cyber threat intelligence and open source. The next one was kind of talking about the various data sets that exist at the open, deep, and dark web. And lastly, it's kind of chat about the future. This is probably the hardest conversation we'll cover today, but I'd love to kind of pick your brain around kind of what the future could look like in terms of, let's say, human in the loop, technologies and what they could look like in the future in terms of like the platforms that people investigate in, maybe data collectors or harvesters, natural language processing, machine learning, that sort of thing. And then, I don't know, maybe some sort of like regulation or better policy around kind of how folks handle data and maybe even get trained up on how to leverage these tools. So that's a lot to dig into. So what do you want to start with?
Honestly, probably the tooling, right?
Okay.
I think probably today, the biggest challenge that we see from an OSINT tooling perspective is that, we've got a lot of repositories, the data in those repositories is generally unstructured,
right.
And when it has structure, there's no agreement on format, right? There's no consistency in format.
Right.
And so it's very difficult it's a big challenge for a lot of analysts to bring that together. And you mentioned machine learning a little bit, and
yep.
Gosh, that's such a buzzword in our industry.
I know, I hate it.
Yeah, so often it's really like black magic when it comes to machine learning.
Total black box.
Yeah, and here, because of the unstructured nature of the data, I think this is a spot where we haven't really seen what machine learning can do yet.
Right.
But with natural language processing, like you mentioned, and potentially deep learning with these unstructured data sets, maybe we get there. I think in the future we definitely will. It's just a question of when.
Right. I mean, we've made attempts at structuring this sort of data as an industry, right? We have sticks and taxis to move all the data around. We have all sorts of SIMs and other tools to try to gather all of these JSON feeds and sticks feeds, and then even just huge swaths of text. But at the end of the day, users are grappling with quite a bit of information, and it's really, really hard for them to make sense of all these disparate data sets in one meaningful way.
Well, sure, and even you mentioned sticks, right, as a format, but we both know, of course, sticks 1.0 and sticks 2.0. One's XML, the other's JSON.
Right.
Vendors say we support sticks, and you're like, which parts of sticks,
part, yeah.
right? And of course, nobody implements it the same, and even the standards aren't standardized. Right.
Yeah, and then of course you start to add in data models to try to make sense of this, and even that, you're basically just adding layers upon layers of brittle things on top of brittle things, and one thing goes wrong, it all goes wrong, and you miss that mission critical sort of alert or find that you might otherwise find in some other capacity.
Yeah, sure. I can't tell you the number of times, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, where you're digging back through data historically, and you're like, why didn't I see this?
Yeah.
And you realize it's like just not quite formatted exactly the way the processor was expecting it, and
brutal.
Yep.
So one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about is like cyber threat intelligence and open source is, of course, there are playbooks and certain kind of paths, investigative paths that you can follow, but really to be a good analyst or practitioner, you really need to be flexible, inquisitive, and on top of kind of the landscape that you're occupying, right? And that's really hard to train someone to do, but I feel like there needs to be some sort of baseline that we all operate from as analysts or practitioners. Obviously, as an instructor, you do a great job at kind of giving people that baseline, but do you think there needs to be like a broader initiative or some sort of baseline certification, like Security Plus sort of thing, for practitioners in CTI and OSINT?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that there's really not too much of a question about that. I'm a big people, process, technology guy, right? As it really comes down to, in that order, right? Take the person, train them on a process, and then add the technology in to make them better. Technology becomes that force multiplier, and so yeah, absolutely. OSINT is one of those things that has such a low barrier to entry, like we discussed earlier, that. Man, it is. It's really easy for somebody to say I am an OSINT analyst and have that not actually mean anything, right? Yeah, I don't know what that means exactly. It's kind of like when somebody says I have a car. You don't know whether it's like a used Pinto or a new Maserati, and there is a world of difference between those two.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see kind of what organization or what sort of certification begins to really take a foothold, because honestly I haven't seen one. Of course SANS provides training. Sure. Then we have folks like Bellingcat on the other hand, and then we have a bunch of little integrators or really specialized folks that are doing very niche sort of trainings specific to an industry or a data type or something else. But there really isn't an overarching formalized structure around this. So again, anyone could say they do CTI or open source, but the reality of it is it's oftentimes a conversation and a gut check to really evaluate how good someone is at their job. So in these next few years, I'd love to see what happens there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, as a hiring manager, this is a challenge that I absolutely grapple with, right? Because as I'm looking for that new CTI analyst, right, I may have somebody that has, one vendor certification, right, is specific to a product, right, or a particular threat intelligence platform, and somebody else has a more, generic certification around security and other. I can't rack and stack those people based on those certifications. It doesn't really even tell me what they know, particularly if the vendors aren't the ones we're using.
Yeah. So the next tricky topic is kind of like almost like regulations, right? Like when people are digging in this particular realm, right, they can have the absolute most killer arsenal of tools and data sets. They can have the most amazing training, but what they're grappling with at the end of the day is usually very sensitive data, right? It could be financial, it could be PII, it could be trade secrets, it could be, they can stumble across a competitor's product or data set or something like that. So do you think there needs to be any sort of regulations in place around this sort of stuff?
Man, that is a can of worms. Do I think there needs to be regulation? I think that, I think it's coming whether we think we need it or not. I'll go ahead and say that. Okay. I think that's a pretty fair, typically technical predictions don't age well, but I think that's a good one that we can say regulation's coming. As far as whether or not we need it, I think some people need it. I think the lower end of the OSINT spectrum fails to, OSINT practitioner spectrum, fails to understand the sensitivity around that data. The Ashley Madison dump is a great example of this, right?
Oh, gosh.
There's a lot of very, very sensitive data there, and we saw some very irresponsible handling of that. That said, that has very, very huge impacts to some organizations from a CTI perspective. And so trained practitioners, right, who know how to handle that kind of data, understand the sensitivity of that data, certainly can make good use of that to help protect organizations. And on the other hand, we have exactly the same data in less skilled, less capable hands, but with the best of intentions, causing all kinds of problems.
Yeah, certainly.
So
just to kind of recap, it sounds like in the future we're going to hopefully come to some sort of unicorn model where we have humans aided by technology, and that'll really be driven by quite a bit of automation in terms of machine learning, NLP, you name it, to kind of clean up these data sets to make it more usable and actionable to the practitioners. Then not only that, there may be some sort of gap in terms of training today that could become more normalized in terms of just certifications and the training portion that we're kind of missing today, because again, it's a gut check and a conversation. And then lastly, regulations, we're going to leave that one alone, but we think that there's something coming in terms of how people handle this stuff. Well, it's going to be an interesting few years, bumpy ride, but hopefully we'll have some interesting, cool tools, some cool findings, and some great analysts in the pipeline. So with that said, again, I appreciate your time. And one last thing is Authenticate. We are running our CTI and OSINT survey. And if you guys would grab the link below and feel free to participate, we should have some really interesting findings to share with you around these very topics around March. So looking forward to seeing what those look like. And again, hey, thank you so very much.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Yeah.